Here we are. You can tell spring's in the air, the wattles come out. Our quintessential Australian scene. Now, the thing about agriculture or growing things, it's very simple. You put in a seed or a plant, you fertilise it, give it water, and if there's enough sun, you'll get a crop. It's very simple. Politics is the same. What we need is policies, because there's no point going ahead unless there are policies. Unfortunately, most of the policies that we see today in Australia are based on the private investment for private profit model. Now, there's a state election on the 28th of November in Victoria. A lot of people say, why bother? Well, I think the COVID-19 pandemic and its continuing effects on the community has highlighted the powers that the state government has in a federation. And Australia is essentially a federation, and the Constitution is a document which regulates the relationship between the states and the central government. Now, over the last 40 years, we've had policies which are based at a state level, in Victoria and most other states, on privatisation and deregulation. And what we've seen is the running down of public assets and the privatisation of these assets. Over the last 8 years, during the Andrews-led so-called socialist left Labor government, what we see is the Labor Party deserting its followers. It has moved into a construction phase, construction for construction's sake. As if we see coliseums being built, and I'm being ironical here obviously, that somehow things are going forward, that we as a state and a nation are going forward. So this state election will be fought primarily between the major parties on the basis of this construction frenzy, this private investment for private profit model, where we see large corporations dominating economic activity. We see the death of micro and small business, and we see governments turning their back on what supposedly is an essential component of 21st century democratic governments, or I should say representative democratic governments. That is, that its primary interest is to look after the citizens within its jurisdiction. But what we are seeing is its primary interest seems to be looking after the needs of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And we've seen the so-called socialist left of the Labor Party, which is currently in government, which has been in government now for almost 8 years, take on policies that promote that 1% and turn its back on a significant proportion of the Victorian population. Not everybody has done badly in Victoria over the last 8 years. The 8% of Victorians who own investment properties have done very well. The 1% have done extraordinarily well. A significant proportion, about half, have tread water, and another 50% basically have found that their standard of living, but more importantly, their psychological status, their futures have been totally compromised by this construction frenzy which has dominated state government activities and which has seen taxpayers' money funded into this construction frenzy, which has seen things like Melbourne ports privatised, Vic roads privatised, in order to get enough capital to bankroll these facilities. And what we've seen is a desertion of a government's primary responsibility, especially a state government's. Basic human needs like food security, energy security, health, housing, education and recreation. Yes, recreation, and I'll expand on that later on during this dissertation. So, we've seen policies which have seen the shrinking of the public housing sector and the privatisation of the public housing sector through management, as well as the transfer of assets to private corporations and private companies, which hide under the umbrella of community affordable social housing. We've seen the cooperative sector, which was set up by the Kane government 30 years ago, almost taken over by the private sector. And the list goes on and on and on. So I do believe that ignoring the state election is a mistake. I do think that activists should seriously consider standing as independents in the state election. Unfortunately, public interest before corporate interests was not able to meet the cut-off date as far as membership is concerned and could not be registered as a Victorian political party. So we need to rely on independents who have policies which are based around the satisfaction of basic human needs, not the current construction frenzy, which at the end of the day doesn't assist anybody except motorists, and I'm one, and I don't mind spending an extra 15 minutes on the roads if it means that people's basic human needs are met. So let's look at food security. A significant number of Victorians, especially during this period of inflation, have issues regarding food security. So what do we propose? Well, I propose that everybody on a social security benefit, and that's about 35 to 40% of Victorians, whether it's old age, whether it's student, whether it's single parents, whether it's disability, receive a $150 food voucher every month, and every dependent child receive a $75 food voucher. And this food voucher is to be spent at government registered micro and small businesses, not in the huge franchises which dominate the marketplace today. So this policy not only provides food security for people who have issues regarding food security, but it also helps micro and small business survive in an era where corporations dominate the marketplace, especially in the food industry. The next issue I'm interested in is energy security. While everybody is talking about huge centralised wind farms and solar farms, many offshore as far as the wind farms are concerned, what we should be looking at in terms of energy security is publicly owned, that's right, publicly owned local energy production facilities. Now we all know that if you put solar panels on your roof, it decreases your energy costs. But what we need is a fail-safe mechanism via which local communities can guarantee energy security by having publicly owned energy production facilities like solar farms in urban and regional areas, as well as wind farms. It can be done. It's been done before. And these decentralised network is the crux of any energy security concerns. And these need to be publicly owned, not privately owned as they are now because of this government and other governments' privatisation agendas in this country over the last 4 to 5 decades. Then we've got the question of housing. It's ridiculous to think that housing prices have increased 40-fold. That's right, 40-fold in the last 50 years, while wages have increased about 7-fold. It's ridiculous to think that people's future, as far as a basic necessity like housing, is totally dependent on the private marketplace. And it's ludicrous to think the state government has actively conducted a campaign to close down the public housing sector in this state. As far as public housing is concerned, Victoria is the worst state in the Federation. And it's the worst state because it's pursued policies to privatise public housing and guarantee titles and investment for the private sector in the community affordable and social housing sector. Situations were so ridiculous that we held a 10-day protest on the steps of the Parliament House during the last state election, and because of the pressure we were able to place on the state government, because I also stood as an independent in the Minister of Housing seat, they promised to build a new 1,000 public housing units. They have not built one, let alone set aside $1 to plan this. Somehow thinking that we're stupid enough to think that social community and affordable housing have anything to do with public housing. So what I'm recommending is a lot of income comes to the state government through the sales tax, which is a tax which is levied on people who buy a home. And it can be up to $70,000 for $1 million home. The government is raking in money and using it for this construction frenzy. At least 50% of money generated through a state-levied sales tax on housing should be allocated to public housing. If we did this, we could house 100,000 Victorians every year in public housing. Let's not forget the irony that over 85% of people in Singapore, which has one of the highest standards of living in the world, live in public housing. And every time you make a phone call, if you are part of the Optus network, the profits which are made by that network, which is totally owned by the Singapore government, go into providing services for the people of Singapore. I mean, they must be laughing. We privatise Telstra, they buy into it, they make a profit, which is fair enough, and that profit goes back to Singapore to ensure their public housing sector continues to function. While here, we squeeze the public housing sector. Not only do we squeeze the public housing sector, we do everything we can as a government not to repair, look after, extend current public housing stock. We've also combined the public housing and community, social and affordable and cooperative housing to force people to join the private housing market. Over 40% of Victorians rent. Less than 3% are in public housing. Of the 60% who are buying their own home, only about 20 to 25% own their own home. And many investors are in a marketplace which is dominated by the needs of investors. I mean, it's ludicrous that 1 million homes are empty in this country out of a total of 11 million, mainly because investors, because of capital gains, buy homes, don't even bother to rent them because they make their money on capital gains. It's a ludicrous situation we find ourselves in. The next thing is public health. There is nothing worse than learning that people cannot access urgent ambulance transport. The people are waiting in accident emergency departments for hours and days in order to be assessed and admitted. That the waiting lists for elective surgery and semi-elective surgery and semi-urgent surgery are so long that many people die waiting for that. So obviously we need to look at new ways of getting income from the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication and the investment class in order to subsidise a decent, universal public housing system. Then we have the question of education. I mean, it brings me to tears, almost to tears, to see private charities collecting money to ensure Australian students accessing a public education have enough money to access that public education. And many students, especially students of people on low incomes and social security benefits now find themselves unable to actively participate in many aspects of the public education sector because their guardians and parents don't have the necessary resources. I mean, that is a shocking state of affairs in any country. And our government may say they've removed or are going to remove 80 level crossings. Wouldn't it be nice for the government to say we will subsidise every child in this state to ensure everybody, irrespective of their parents' income, gets the same level of access to the public education sector? So then we have recreation. Now, some people in our society never have a holiday, never. Cannot afford a holiday, especially if you can't afford food. How can you afford a holiday? And obviously recreation is an important part of anybody's life. And what I'm suggesting is that anybody who earns less than $1,000 a week or is on a social security benefit receive a $2,000 voucher every 4 years and a $1,000 voucher every 4 years for every dependent child to have a holiday in this state, in Victoria. This boosts the Victorian tourist industry and assists small and micro business to survive. Now you may say, well, this sounds like pie in the sky, Joe. But the reality is that we can fund it with a new range of state-based taxes. We can ensure that people have food security, energy security, a decent public housing sector, decent public education, decent public health, and able to have a little bit of recreation time every few years. And we can do this by, one, quarantining 50% of sales tax on housing into the public housing sector. I said before that will house 100,000 Victorians every year in the public housing sector. This puts downward pressure on rents because private investors will find themselves in a situation, the more people in the public housing sector, the less need for people to rent privately, because anybody who can't afford a deposit for a house should be eligible for public housing, not just extreme emergencies as we have today. Then another tax I'd like to see is a 1% super land tax on any individual, corporation, association that has more than $5 million of land. Now obviously there's a land tax system, but an extra 1% for those that own more than $5 million would actually go a long way to resolving the issues around public health and public education. Now many companies today do not own buildings but rent buildings. So any association, individual, corporation, organisation that spends more than $5 million per year on rent in Victoria pay a 1% levy. A 1% levy for each dollar above $5 million. Then many of the new companies in the gig economy, which I call the 19th century economy, which bypasses government regulation to protect workers, which bypasses trade unions, which exploits not only the workers but the businesses they provide services for, making themselves indispensable, neither rent nor own property. And that's how they maximise profits, which they then send overseas in the terms of millions of dollars. Any corporation, association, individual in the gig economy that has more than a $5 million turnover per year pay a 5% levy. That's right, a 5% levy. These gig companies are parasites. They exploit their workers, they exploit their customers, they exploit the organisations and businesses they have disrupted. They're parasites. The sooner they leave this country, the better. The fact that would mean there'd be more room for businesses to conduct their businesses. Now, these are just a few of the ideas that can be used to fund these initiatives. But what we need is a policy shift. I'm interested in standing against the Premier, Mr. Daniel Andrews, in the electorate of Mulgrave. Not because I'm going to be elected, but to force a policy shift re the state government. To force a policy shift from the construction frenzy to a policy shift which addresses the need to allow basic human needs in health, education, housing, energy, food, recreation to be met by the government of the day. This is about causing a policy shift from the current private investment for private profit, which is mainly profiting large transnational corporations involved in the construction industry. So in order for this to occur, we need to crawl before we walk and walk before we run. The first hurdle that needs to be crossed is for people in the electorate of Mulgrave, and this is an electorate which encompasses about 35,000 houses and I think 50 to 60,000 people. If you're familiar with Melbourne, it stretches from Ferntree Gully Road in the north to Heatherton Road in the south, to Westall Road in the west, and the southeastern tollway and Dandenong Creek in the east. This is the electorate which encompasses Mulgrave and Springvale, two totally different, disparate areas. Springvale has many small businesses which struggle to survive. Mulgrave, although a middle class suburb, many people, especially children of people living in these areas, will never be able to get into a home, are having issues as far as public education is concerned. So these are issues which need to be met, and this is via a policy shift. Once I've found enough people in this electorate to nominate me to stand against the Premier, then the next step, that's the crawling, will be to walk. It's about having some massive leafleting campaigns which obviously need your financial support, letterboxing, and then comes the election itself. Not just election day, because over 50% of Victorians will cast their ballot before election day, but about being on pre-polling booths handing out material. So we crawl, we walk, we run. Currently we're at the crawling stage. If we get to the walking stage, I'll ask for financial contributions in order to fund, and not only financial contributions, but the support of people physically in terms of letterboxing. And then if we get through that phase, then we come to the next phase, pre-polling and polling day. This is an important period where having people at the polling booth can sway people's viewpoints. Now, as I said before, this is a campaign about shifting policy. It's not a campaign about electing me. It's about shifting policy from the current construction frenzy to policies based on the satisfaction of basic human needs. If you're interested, give us a call, 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. Contact me via my Facebook page, Joseph Toscano, or email me at info@pibci.net.